She wants emotional reciprocity, she being the NT wife, neurotypical. But in pretty much all cases, and I work with men only, women only, groups of couples only. I have all the demographics covered, all the bases covered. And in almost all cases, the NT wife's approach to try to get you to be emotionally reciprocal ends up raising your anxiety such that you want to just disconnect from her, purely for anxiety reduction purposes, which yields the opposite result of what she's trying to do. And I'm not trying to blame her I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I will go on record as saying that her method of getting you to be a team player and getting you to connect and be more empathic and affectionate, her method of going about that has in too many cases driven you away, which makes, not to blame her, I mean, you have your share, you're contributing to the issues as well, but when you pull away, and in many cases, I got to tell you guys, in many cases, she has become his number one source of anxiety. She's come that far up in status as she is now my number one source of anxiety. I mean, I'm not saying that connecting with her is not important to you. It's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying her need for the connection is more important to her than it is you. And if she were here, she would say, you don't provide enough emotional reciprocity, that you don't listen. I'm just going to make some things up that you've probably heard. You don't listen, you don't empathize, you don't validate me, and so on and so on. You've probably heard it all many times before. And so if this has gone on for years and years and years, you may have experienced this too. She is super resentful and angry, and maybe even at some level revengeful. And so what has happened, and I'm not blaming you guys, you're wired the way that you're wired. There's nothing wrong with you. It is what it is. But by virtue of your supposed lack of empathy and her heightened resentment, we're going to call that a cancer in the relationship. So you guys, most of you are experiencing a relationship cancer right now, and you're in the middle. You've just begun treatment last week. Last Wednesday, you just began treatment. And so the whole point of this conversation is that you can, as much as I almost hate to say it, because it sounds kind of disconcerting at some level, you guys are in for the long haul. You have to be in for the long haul. This is not something we're going to resolve in a few weeks of meeting here. You're going to have to apply the assignments that we talk about. You're going to have to be consistent with it. And she is going to have to see some significant change. So there's actually going to be three things. It's going to have to be significant change. In other words, something that really stands out in her attention. It's going to have to be consistent change. In other words, change that remains consistent over time. And with those two things, a fairly radical change that she views, consistent over time, then and only then will she begin to reduce her resentment level. Right now, it's most likely that many of you guys are experiencing the thing where her heart is cold as ice. And she probably has lost trust. She's probably given up hope in some cases. And she's also probably reluctant to give you the benefit of the doubt so early, even if she does witness some significant change, because if she were here, she would say, well, I know there's been times before when he's changed, supposedly changed, but it never lasted very long. And it was just a matter of time before he went back to his old ways. So even if she saw some consistent change in you, a significant change in your empathy level, we'll say, she still wouldn't be necessarily willing to acknowledge it, because she would be concerned that if I start having hope again and he lets me down again, I'm not sure I can handle it. So she may even be withholding affection or acknowledgement or praise or pointing out that you're actually doing something right for fear of being let down again. So everybody in here is in for a long haul deal. You have to be willing to tough this out and realize that this fix, for the lack of a better term, is not going to happen anytime soon. That's not to say you wouldn't see some improvement if you're doing the assignments. You should be able to see some improvement in her response to you, but it's not going to be anything real super observable or noticeable for quite a while, because again, she's going to have to see significant change, and she's going to have to see that spread out over the course of the next several months before she's going to have a change in attitude. And that change of attitude in her mind would be, you know what, he is making some significant changes, and he has been consistently doing so over the last 3 or 4 months. Maybe he really has turned the corner.
So the general philosophy of people on the autism spectrum, and this is very generalized by the way, is based in the belief system that people are largely just in the way of me completing tasks. People are mostly an impediment to me engaging in my special interest. People are mostly obstacles to me engaging in my self-soothing anxiety reduction activities. So based on that belief system, the inner dialogue or self-talk is usually along the lines of, I must be able to engage in my special interest as often as possible for anxiety reduction reasons. I need to be distracted with something pleasurable to escape the anxieties experienced in the real world. And I need to engage in activities that alleviate boredom, because most things outside of my special interest are painfully boring. So based on that self-talk, the emotion that's evoked is often one of frustration. In fact, it is exceedingly common, in fact, we will say 100% of the time, for people on the autism spectrum to have low frustration tolerance. Feelings of frustration are largely due to people getting in the way of completing tasks, disrupting their routine and structure, and imposing change on them, unwanted change. When this happens, the feelings of frustration can then graduate to anger or anxiety overload, the first of which may manifest in the form of a meltdown or tantrum, the second of which may result in a shutdown. So based on that particular belief system and the associated self-talk and the associated feelings of frustration and anger, behaviorally, the individual will appear rigid, self-absorbed, disconnected from relationships, and preoccupied with things. In other words, tasks, objects, facts, figures, and so on. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I have a message for the NT spouses. And of course, we know that NTs can be male or female. We know ASD individuals can be male or female. I'm going to use the example where she is the NT and he is the guy on the autism spectrum. And so she will often say, we still have problems. He's not improving. Nothing gets better. We're still having communication breakdown and so on. And then on closer inspection, I realize that she is continuing to treat him like a neurotypical. She continues to insist on approaching him as if he was normal. He is not normal. Stop it, okay? He's not normal. And the more you assume that he is going to respond to your neurotypical ways, the more frustrated you're going to be. You wouldn't treat a snapping turtle like a toy poodle, right? You wouldn't give a snapping turtle a bone. You wouldn't play catch with it. You wouldn't have it sit on your lap and pet it. You wouldn't take it to the groomers. You wouldn't take it for a walk around the park and so on. And the longer you treated this snapping turtle like a toy poodle, the more frustrated this turtle is going to get, to the point where he may snap, and now you're missing the tip of your thumb and you wonder what you did wrong. Here's a rhetorical question for you. Let's pretend that you met up with somebody from a different planet. And this person had a blind spot, a huge blind spot, with respect to how you think, how you feel, and why you behave the way you do. How would you try to communicate with that entity? How would you respond? How would you try to help? So in this example, let's say that you realize that this person from a different planet had this huge blind spot, but then you took it on yourself to try to improve him, as if he shouldn't be wired that way. And in this scenario, imagine that the harder you tried to fix a deficit that you perceived to be a deficit, the bigger his blind spots became. And then it got to the point where this entity gets so frustrated that now he gives up trying to communicate with you at all. Because, ladies, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with somebody who has a huge blind spot with respect to what and why you think the way you do, what and why you feel the way you do, what and why you behave the way you do. And so when you take offense of that, and I'm not blaming you, it's easy to do, but when you take offense of that and try to get him to get it, you're treating your snapping turtle like a toy poodle. And it's getting tired of being dragged around by a dog leash. And the more you do this, the more that snapping turtle is going to get frustrated and snap back. Fighting multiple battles is making you physically and mentally sick. I run into all the time, really, neurodiverse couples who fight every battle that comes down the pike. Neurodiverse couples are notorious for just piling a bunch of disputes on the table without categorizing, prioritizing. They won't talk about how sex isn't good, the money problems, kid problems, quality time or lack thereof, chores are not getting done, or somebody feels like they're doing all the chores, and pet peeves, dirty dishes, the in-laws, and the list just goes on. And they're both just chasing their tails, quite honestly. And the problem with that is, if you are not judicious about which battles to fight and you just fight everything, then you become toxic to one another. And you get the two of you in the same room, and it almost always ends up in some kind of a debate or argument or fight, etc. The problem with this is people who fight every battle that comes down the pike also are in a lot of emotional pain. Chronic, low-grade emotional pain is what I call it. And those who are in chronic, low-grade emotional pain tend to perceive slights and disrespect where there is none. And if they are always on the alert for any sign of disrespect or lack of cooperation or a personal insult or being controlled by the other person, etc., they're going to be much more willing to continue to fight every battle that comes down the pike. So over time, they're fighting more and more battles, thus increasing the emotional pain, and you're in this cycle. So obviously, you would want to do the opposite of that. And my suggestion would be to pick the top 3 issues that you want to resolve. I'm not saying don't fight any battles, and I am saying you want to do fair fighting, but you don't want to fight every battle that comes down the pike. And so I would say pick 3. Just for starters, pick 3, but don't fight all 3 at one time. So brainstorm about the most important issues. Keep it to 3 just for now. Try to have some dialogue on one of those 3. And then when you get some resolve on one of those, then you can move on to the second one. Then you can move on to the third one. All others are not fair game for one damn comment. Let me repeat that. Anything outside of those top 3 is not fair game for debate, argument, discussion, etc. Pick your battles carefully. And if you choose to fight every battle that comes down the pike, you are choosing mental illness and physical illness. And if you're getting sick by fighting too many battles at once, hasn't manifested in mental health issues or physical health issues yet, give it a few years, and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So another common concern that comes up with NT wives about their autistic husband is she will say something along the lines of, he won't answer my questions. I'll ask him, what took you so long? He will say, I don't know. Or she'll ask, what are you planning to do with such and such? And he'll say, never mind. Or he just won't respond to her questions at all. And so what's up with this in the vast majority of cases is he knows that if he answers that question, that's just going to open the floodgates for a bunch of other questions. Or he's simply afraid to answer the question because he feels like he's going to get in trouble for the answer. So if you have asked him a question and then he answers your question, but then you follow that up with 12 other questions, he's going to download that as I'm being interrogated. This raises my anxiety. Or if you have asked a question and he gave you the answer and you didn't like it and then you had a problem with the answer and chastised him accordingly, then he's going to be gun shy about answering any of your questions. Or he is going to give you the answer that he thinks you want to hear just to get you off of his back. So one of the things that you could do in this case would be to let him know prior to asking the question that you're not going to be asking follow-up questions, or he's not going to be in trouble for the answer to the question. So you could say, I've got one question. I would like the answer to it. I promise not to follow that up with a dozen other questions, and I promise not to use your answer as an opportunity to get punitive or parental. So if he knows he's not going to be interrogated or criticized, he's going to be much more likely to answer your one question. If you're the type of person with high anxiety, you're constantly getting fooled into believing that there's something to be afraid of in the absence of real danger. Fear is when you're afraid of something and you know what it is. Anxiety, though, is when you're afraid of something but you don't know what it is. Anxiety is deceiving because when we feel discomfort, we get tricked into treating it like a real threat. But as the rational part of your brain knows, discomfort is not dangerous. When there is true danger at hand, we either freeze up, run, or fight back. If the threat looks faster and stronger than you, you may freeze up. If the threat looks stronger than you, but slower, you may run away from it. If the threat looks weaker than you, you may fight back. Unfortunately, for people on the autism spectrum, people are their main source of discomfort. And then their body gets tricked into believing that certain individuals are truly dangerous. And if this happens, they will either argue with the other person, which is fight, avoid the other person, which is flight, or they would feel intimidated by the other person, which is a form of freezing. Your natural instinct to protect yourself is what leads you to get deceived by anxiety. So why haven't you been able to see the pattern of repeated episodes of anxiety that never actually lead to a fair outcome? Since your worst case scenarios never come to fruition, why don't you gradually lose your unreasonable anxiety around these scenarios? Well, there's several reasons for this. You took protective steps and there was no disaster. Therefore, you started believing that these steps that you took saved you from disaster. But these steps that you took that supposedly saved you from disaster also cause you to worry more about the next dangerous episode. It convinces you that you were very vulnerable and must always protect yourself. The real reason you didn't experience a disaster is that such disasters are not part of fear or phobia. We're talking about anxiety disorders, not disaster disorders. You get through the experience because the experience isn't actually life-threatening, but it's justifiably hard for you to recognize that at the time. You may be more likely to think that you just had a narrow escape, and this leads you to redouble your self-protection steps. It's these self-protection steps that actually maintain and strengthen the deceptiveness of anxiety. If, for example, we think we just escaped a disaster because we went back and checked the stove 10 times, then we're going to continue to feel vulnerable and continue to feel the need for self-protection. When this happens over and over, we're going to get stuck in the habit of protecting ourselves by certain means. This is when chronic anxiety gets entrenched into our life. We think we're actually helping ourselves, but we're actually getting tricked into making things worse, and this is how deceptive anxiety is. For those of you who have chronic anxiety, you may have noticed that the harder you try to escape it, the worse it gets. The more you fight it, the more you're stuck with it. Thus, if the harder we try, the worse it gets, then what we need to do is to take another look at the protective steps we've been using. With high anxiety, we've been deceived into trying to protect ourselves against something that isn't dangerous, and this makes our anxiety worse over time. So what do we do instead? We allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling, as uncomfortable as it is. Know that this feeling of uncomfortableness will be short-lived, and it will not be life-threatening. So you simply want to allow yourself to feel that emotional pain because, as I stated earlier, running from it makes it chase you. It will chase after you and bring out even more fear as you run for your life. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAsperger'sChat.com, and today I have a message for men on the autism spectrum who are married to a neurotypical wife, and I want to discuss with you briefly what I'm going to call the anxiety scale for risky conversations. Now, the reason I say risky conversations is because there's times when she wants to approach you and talk to you about something that's important to her, but it may be a little on the heavy side or loaded with some emotionality on her part, and so you are at risk of doing some version of a shutdown or a meltdown. And as she talks, the longer it goes, the more your anxiety comes up, and so we want to let her know, you want to let her know on a scale of 1 to 5 where your anxiety is. So the anxiety scale ranges from 1 to 5, 1 being very low anxiety with 5 being very high. Now, you'll want to use this scale when she's talking to you about important and perhaps even stressful topics. So as she is delivering her message, you are keeping a check on your anxiety level and where you're at on that scale, 1 being low, 5 being high. Now, when you feel that in your estimation you've hit a level 3, you are going to have difficulty listening, understanding, and retaining her information, and you're going to be at risk of experiencing some version of a meltdown or shutdown or false agreement. False agreement is simply when you agree with her just to hurry up and get the conversation over with. So at level 3, it would be best for you to call a timeout, but let her know this is not a shutdown. You can say, I'm at a level 3, I'm having a hard time retaining your information. Your information is important to you, so it's important to me too, but I need to take a brief timeout so I can get back down to level 1 on my anxiety scale. Okay, so you're letting her know this is a timeout, not a shutdown, and we will resume this discussion. Now, this is going to help you avoid shutdowns and meltdowns because it breaks up her sometimes rather large message into smaller, more manageable bite-sized chunks. So let's say you've hit level 3. You let her know, I'm not tracking your information very well now. Let me go take a timeout. I'll come back when I'm at level 1. You come back down to level 1. You let her know, I'm ready to continue this conversation. And when you come back for round 2, if you hit level 3 again, just repeat the process. As long as she knows that this is a timeout designed to help you listen, understand, and retain her message, she's probably going to be open to that. As long as she knows this is not an excuse to have a shutdown and to avoid the topic. There's never a great reason to bring up the past, unless, of course, it's to reflect on a positive memory, something that the two of you did together that was pleasant. Short of that, however, bringing up the past basically poisons the present moment. Think of a moment in time. It's less than a second in length, right? So this video is only a few seconds old at this point. There's been dozens of moments within this time frame already. So the moment is less than a second in length. But when you bring up the past, look at the lengthy history of the past. It could be 5, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. So when you bring up the past, you're dragging a very lengthy recollection of pain into the current moment. When you bring up the past, you experience content memory, which is the hurtful things that were said and done. You also experience emotional memory. In other words, how you felt during the incident in question. So when you bring up the past, which is years old at this point, you're overloading the present moment, toxifying it. Think of it like this. You're eating a bowl of soup with the appropriate amount of sodium, but you decide you're going to take the whole salt shaker and dump the whole thing in there. Now you've contaminated it. There's no way you could eat it. It would make you sick if you did. So when you bring up the past, you're dragging in decades of hurt into the present moment. And where does that get you? What have you actually achieved doing that? In most cases, you have just created yet another painful memory. So when you bring up the hurtful things of the past, you're going to remember what was said and done. You're going to remember how you felt. It's going to instantly open up old wounds, and you have toxified or overloaded the current moment. You have dumped years of misery into a few seconds. Never any great reason to bring up the past. So guys, one of the complaints that your NT wife might have is that you don't engage in give and take in conversation. She may be sitting there in the same room as you and say something, and then you don't respond because you're not sure if it's something you should respond to. You may be thinking, well, that wasn't a question. It was just a random statement that doesn't require any kind of response from me. So here's the deal, guys. Anytime she says something, she's wanting a response. Every time she says something, it would be helpful if you would respond. And if you want to go the extra mile, not only just respond to her statement, but try to keep the conversation going. So if she makes a statement and you think it's just a random comment that does not even really require any response, it requires a response. So respond, go the extra mile, and try to stretch that out into an actual give and take of conversation. You can ask an inquiring question to keep the conversation going. I cannot express to you guys how much this is important because this is one of the main things that gets in the way of her feeling like she's getting emotional reciprocity. She will say, well, I say something to him, I get no response. Just silence. I get the silent treatment a lot, talking to myself. I might as well be a potted plant sitting in the corner with no opinions and no wants, needs, desires, expectations, and so on. So, you have your assignment. You get it? Okay, then do it.
He knows that he sucks at social skills because he probably learned that as a child. And so if you were a little kid and your parents signed you up for Little League or T-ball or whatever, and you just didn't have the knack for that, and you got benched, you just basically sucked. So you ended up kind of being the bat boy, and it was a terrible experience. I'm never playing baseball again. I suck at that. I was never any good at it. They started me way out in the outfield, and then the coach wasn't even happy with me way out there, and he just benched me, and I just sat on the bench the entire season. So now that I have been benched by the coach, and I know that I'm not a good baseball player, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, well, would you like to join this team and learn how to play baseball? It's like, no, I've already been around that block. I suck at it. No. I don't have any interest in learning baseball or learning how to be a better pitcher or a better batter. And I'm perfectly fine not playing baseball. And so that's exactly what's going on with your husband, is that he knows he's terrible at it. He's had a bad experience with it. And talking is a social activity. Of course he doesn't want to talk. And it's a shame that he feels that way because social skills can be taught. And the give and take in conversation can be taught. And he would actually get to the point where he probably enjoy conversing and enjoy talking because he's actually doing it fairly adeptly for the first time in his life. So he might even find some joy in having conversation about something other than his topic of interest. The two of you are wired so differently that it makes perfect sense why you would have this conflict. He's speaking French, you're speaking German. And that sets up all kind of problems because with some of his traits, mind blindness, alexithymia, weak central coherence, some executive function deficit, he is wired such that her conversation style, which is very social and very emotional, raises his anxiety. And so he can't, for a variety of reasons that we will get into, it's hard for him to listen to a difficult conversation about the relationship problems. Since this causes so much anxiety, he engages in anxiety reduction, which could be meltdown, shutdown, pretending to listen, but not really. There's a variety of things. And then she views that as he doesn't care about the relationship. I'm not important. He's insensitive, selfish, narcissistic, and all of that. So not to sound blaming to the NT's wives in here, but your assessments of why he did or didn't do certain things or did or didn't say certain things was in many cases way off base. And he's way off base in his assessments of you as well, because with mind blindness, as some of you probably know, he, and I'm speaking in general terms here, has a hard time of peeling himself out of his skin, climbing behind her eyeballs, and looking through her perception of things and getting a good grasp on why she thinks the way she does, and why she feels the way she does, and why she behaves the way she does, and why she has certain opinions and perspectives. He can't do that. He can't put himself in your shoes and imagine what you might be thinking or feeling, or why you have a certain opinion about stuff. And so since he's not sure, he will tend to fill in the blank with something just because he wants to try to make sense of her, and he always misses the mark. And it's even slightly worse than that, because he will tend to fill in the blank not only with a false assumption, but with a negative spin, and will assign kind of negative connotations on her motive.